Hilchos Temidin Umusafin Perek Chamishi, the laws of the daily and additional services and sacrifices in the temple, chapter 5. At the end of yesterday, we talked a little bit about the lechem haponim, the showbreads that were divided every week between the entering and exiting, rotating watch of the Kohanim. Today, we're going to be exclusively focused on the lechem haponim, the mitzvahs that surround it, baking it, making it, and how exactly it was set up on the table every Shabbos. Halacha Aleph mitzvah saseh. It's a positive mitzvah, l'sader lechem haponim b'chol yom Shabbos, to set up the bread of faces. That's the literal meaning of lechem haponim, the bread of surfaces, and we'll soon see why it's called that. You set up the lechem haponim on every Shabbos day, al hashulchan, lifnei Hashem, on the table in front of Hashem, baheichol, inside the temple structure. Shanemar, as it says in the verse which we recite every Shabbos after the Musaf prayer. And it comes from the Torah, the section talking about the lechem haponim. It says, b'yom hashabbos yarchenu. Every single Shabbos day, he should set it up. The Rambam has in this text the word hakayin, but that's not from the actual Torah. The Torah says, b'yom hashabbos yarchenu. He should set it up, the goymer, etc. Halacha beis v'davar barur b'Torah. The details about the lechem haponim are explicit in the Torah. It's a clear matter in the Torah, shuhu shteimas rechalis, that it's a total of 12 breads. Kol chala shnei esreinim, every bread formed from 2 isarains of flour, and it was set up in 2 rows or 2 columns. 6 breads in every column. Chala al gabe chala, set up one on top of the other, 1 bread on top of the other. Ubein kol shtei chalois shleisha kanim shel zahav. Between every 2 breads there was 3 tubes of gold that allowed for some air to run between the breads, so that air could blow through it. You don't see them here because they're being set up, but maybe here's a little clearer. This is a picture from the Art Scroll Chumash. No, you also don't really see the tubes in between the breads, but suffice to say that in between every one of the breads there was these 3 tubes running through it to provide some air between one bread and the next. Every column of breads was supported by 2 supports. In this picture, each support is itself 3 little columns, but together they made up 1 support. So on this side there was 1 support, on that side there was 1 support, so each column had 2 supports. Near every column there was a little utensil that had a 3 fingers full of levaina of frankincense. Here they put it on top just for illustration purposes, but it was actually on the table on the side of each column. Shanemar, also clear in the verse, v'nasata al hamareches levaina zaka. Near the set up row of breads, you should put pure frankincense. Ukli zehu anikra bazach, the utensil in which the frankincense was placed is called the bazach. Nimtzu shnei kumte levaina b'shnei abazichin. So you now have 3 fingersfuls of frankincense in the 2 bazichin, in the 2 small containers. B'shulayim hayula bazichin, these bazichin had bottoms, flat bottoms, kedei sheyanichum ala shulchan, so they could be placed on the table on the shulchan. Halacha gimel shnei hasdarim ma'akvin zeh zeh. Having 2 rows is essential, one to the other. Ushnei abazichin ma'akvin zeh zeh. The 2 spoons containing the frankincense were essential to one another. V'hasdarim v'habazichin ma'akvin zeh zeh. And the rows of bread and the containers with the frankincense are also essential to one another. In other words, you cannot be missing anything. You can't be missing part of the bread, you can't be missing part of the spoons, you can't have all the bread without the spoons or the spoons without the bread. When you inaugurate the table in its initial use, it is done with placing the showbread on the table on Shabbos. On every Shabbos, you take off the bread that has been there on the table since the last Shabbos, and you set up new bread. And the bread that's taken off after a week, that's the one that's divided between the ingoing and outgoing rotations of Kohanim, together with the high priest, as we saw yesterday. And they eat them. How exactly do we go about setting up the breads? 4 Kohanim come in to the temple structure. 2 holding the 2 rows of breads, and 2 holding the 2 spoons. That's these 4 Kohanim over here. He's holding one of the new rows, he has the other new row, and they have the 2 spoons. 4 more Kohanim come before them. 2 to take the 2 rows from last week, And the other two, you can't see the eighth guy over here, the fourth guy of the second group, but he's also there to take the 2 spoons. The incoming ones stand on the north side of the temple structure, facing south. The ones going out stand in the south, facing north. This one pulls off the breads, and these one put on the new breads, with the breads literally being within a handbreadth of each other. So this picture may not be exactly accurate. The idea is that they're supposed to be placed and taken off simultaneously. These 2 guys would drag the breads off the table this way, and these 2 guys would be placing it on simultaneously with them, so that it was never left empty. Shenemar, because it says, Lefanai tamid. The breads have to be in front of me constantly. Always. Even when they switch. You should do your best to maintain some kind of bread always being on the table. Halacha hey, Yatsu, the Kohanim would go out with last week's bread, v'nosnu es halechem shayitziu al shulchan zav acher shaya be'ulam, and they would put the breads down on a different golden table that was in the antechamber, the entrance chamber to the temple structure. V'hiktiru habezichin, they would leave the bread there, go offer the spoons of frankincense on the altar. V'achar kach mechalken achalis, then come back and divide the breads. If Yom Kippur came out to be on Shabbos, as is going to be this coming year, God willing, Yom Kippur will be on Shabbos, so of course you cannot eat a lechem hapanim on that day, it's a fast day. You divide the breads only in the evening after Yom Kippur is over. Halacha vav, keitzad maaseh lechem hapanim. How were the lechem hapanim made? What was the formation process for them? Maybe arba ve'esrim se'im chitim aru'uyin limenachos. You bring 24 sa'ah, dry measurement of wheat that could be used for flour offerings. We strike them and we beat them, like all the other wheat used for flour offerings had these things done to them to make them super fine. They would then ground. Then by sifting it 11 times, you would end up with 24 isarins of flour. From 24 sa'ah, you ended up with only 24 isarins. And then from these 24 isarins, 2 isarins per chalav, they made 2 breads that were actually matzah. They may have been thick, but they weren't allowed to rise for more than 18 minutes. They didn't become chametz. If you didn't sift them 11 times, or if you didn't get the fine flour from an original quantity of 24 sa'ah, as long as they were done with proper fine white flour, they're kosher. These amounts were only said as the ideal way, the optimum way of fulfilling the mitzvah. The kneading and the shaping was done outside. The baking was done inside the temple courtyard, like any other flour offering. They were kneaded one at a time and baked 2 at a time. And they were baked in molds. There were 3 golden molds that were used in shaping these breads. The first one, the bread was placed in while it's still dough, raw dough. The second one was the mold in which it was baked. The raw dough was placed into the second mold to be baked. And the third one was the mold in which it was placed once it was removed from the oven, so its form shouldn't be ruined, it should retain its form. Every bread of the lechem hapanim was square. Shenemar lechem hapanim. The Torah uses the terminology lechem hapanim, the bread of the faces. It's one of the verses. There's other verses where it says the same expression. I just chose one. And what it means is sheyilei panim rabim. It has to have many faces. It's got to be square. It's got to be even somewhat cubical. It should also have, rising vertical sides. It was 10 tfachim, 10 handbreadths long, 5 handbreadths wide. 7 finger breadths tall. The table itself upon which the lechem hapanim rested was 12 by 6. So the breads are 10 by 5, and this is 12 by 6, which means you would place the length of the bread on the width of the table. So the breads were actually sticking out 2 handbreadths on each side, because it was only 6 handbreadths wide, and the breads were 10 handbreadths long. And then and then you would lift up the dough this side and that side, so so that it would be flush with the width of the shulchan. And a little bit of space should remain in between where the two ends are folded in. As you can see in the picture, they're basically baked as flat squares, lifted up and folded over, and this way you now have a folded over piece of bread. Then you put one bread on top of the other till you have 6. Then you have on the other side also 6. So in the end, when they were laid down initially, they would be bigger than the width of the table, then they were folded over to be flush, and then everything was beautifully stacked on the shulchan. Halacha Yud, ein afias lechem aponim deiches haShabbos v'lo Yom Tov. Baking the lechem aponim did not override Shabbos or holiday. Ela be'erev Shabbos oifin nesan v'irche nesan l'machar. They were baked on the day before Shabbos and set onto the table the next day. V'im chalu shnei amim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah liyas b'chamishi u've'erev Shabbos. Consider the scenario where, like this coming year also, God willing, Rosh Hashanah will be on Thursday and Friday. So you now have 2 days of holiday plus Shabbos. Oifin oisan miyem revi. The next week's lechem aponim was baked on the Wednesday before. So it would only be a week and a half since it's baking till it was eaten. It's a big miracle. Talmud says the bread would stay warm and fresh throughout the entire time, even though it was sitting there for a long time. The setting up of the tubes between the breads and the removal of the tubes between the breads do not override Shabbos. You have to come in on Friday, pull them out, and place them against the length of the table. And on Sunday you came in and put the tubes in. That's probably why in this picture you don't see the tubes, because this is on Shabbos. Tubes weren't there on Shabbos. So they were only put in the next day, taken out the day before, put in the next day. Let's say you set up the breads properly on Shabbos, but you didn't put the spoons of the frankincense till the next day. And then the next Shabbos you offered the spoons. The bread is disqualified, it's not holy. If you were to set up the breads and the spoons on Sunday, and offer the contents of the bread and those bowls after the next Shabbos, the bread is not holy, it is disqualified. But if in this scenario where both the breads and the spoons were set up on Sunday, and then the spoons were offered the next Shabbos, the bread has not become disqualified. What do you do with these breads and bowls that were set up after Shabbos? Leave them on the table till a full Shabbos passes with them on the table. And the next Shabbos you offer the spoons, right after that Shabbos that had passed while they were set up, and then it's fine. Because technically speaking, even if you leave the bread and the spoons for many Shabbos on the table, it's no problem. So where you put it on Sunday, let it pass over a full Shabbos with the bread on the table, and the next Shabbos bring the spoons, and that'll count as a good sacrifice. Let's say you set up the breads and the spoons properly on Shabbos. But you only offer the spoons after Shabbos. Whether after this Shabbos or a later Shabbos, the bread becomes disqualified. They literally become like sacrificial meat. That's become disqualified. For which you're liable on account of consuming pigul, sacrificial meat offered with the wrong intent, leftover meat, impure ritually, as will be explained. Halacha tezvav nifrisa chala achas min alechem, if one of the breads split, they broke. If it broke before removal of the bread from the table, halechem pasol, the bread is disqualified, you can't bring the spoons, offer them on the altar. But if after you took off the bread, that's when it broke, halechem pasol, while the bread is disqualified, you could offer the spoons on the altar. Once the time of removing the bread came, it's as if you removed it. And therefore, if at that point the bread breaks, even if it's on the table, you can offer the spoons, even if you haven't even removed the pile of bread. If one of the rows of bread became ritually impure, some rodent touched it or whatever, or one of the spoons became impure, what's impure is pure, but what's impure is impure, but what's pure, it's pure. Eat the breads that are pure, offer the spoons that are pure, do whatever you can in terms of doing this mitzvah.